Let's get a little bit of a poll on our session today. We're talking about succession planning. In a previous life, I did some research on some of these issues, and we found that it was something like 20 or 25%, only 20 or 25% of organizations, nonprofit organizations, actually had a succession plan. I'm assuming you're all at a not-for-profit organization. How many of your organizations have a succession plan? We've got two succession plans in the room. So Robin, kudos, this is an important topic. We need succession planning. Today we're going to be talking about succession planning. All organizations, regardless of size, strive for continuity of thought and leadership as it relates to board, senior management, and program leadership. The question for us is, how can nonprofit organizations plan for sustainability and stability, knowing that leadership will evolve over time and that traditional succession planning models may not apply? To lead us in this, we have Robin Cardozo. He was returning to 5 Good Ideas. For those of you who have been around, this is Robin's 3rd time as an expert, which tells you a lot about Robin. He has expertise and experience that is incredibly valuable to the sector. In fact, he was one of our first presenters in 2004. He has himself a long and impressive career which has taken him from the United Way of Greater Toronto to the Ontario Trillium Foundation to the Sick Kids Foundation, where he is currently the Chief Operating Officer, but actually set to leave at the end of December. So Sick Kids lost, and I think they're in the process of doing their own succession implementation. He has also served on many boards, including Soul Pepper Theatre and the Ontario Nonprofit Network. So I think you will agree with me that he is a perfect moderator for today's discussion on succession planning and leadership continuity. But Robin is also an innovator, and so the format for today's 5 Good Ideas session is going to be different. As you will notice on your sheet, we don't have 5 good ideas yet. He has invited 3 of his colleagues to join him on a panel to shape the discussion. We are delighted to have with us today Anita Abraham, Helen Burstyn, and Michael Mori. Robin will do a further introduction when he gets started. But this panel also is not going to give you 5 good ideas, but they're going to work with all of us, all session participants, to collaborate in building that list. I think we're crowdsourcing our good ideas today to enhance succession planning, stability, and sustainability. I leave it to Robin to introduce and to take us through this innovative approach to good ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that introduction of the subject. And I have to say to you and to Maytree, congratulations for everything that you do. I've been a fan and a watcher of Maytree for many, many years, and everything you do is always so amazing. So congratulations and keep up the great work. I have to say that, listening to Elizabeth, I have to say up front, I think I'm here under false pretenses. Because you described me as being an expert, and this is a subject that I'm absolutely not an expert on. And when we were discussing this with Katrina and Marcus, we felt that, number one, that this is an important subject, succession planning and transition thinking. Number two, we didn't really think that there were a lot of people who might describe themselves as experts. However, a lot of people have thought about the issue. A lot of people have really good experiences. So we said, let's try something new. Let's have a great panel, and I'm delighted with the panel who have agreed to participate. And let's ask participants to take part in coming up with the 5 good ideas. So we're going to do this together. So keep your thinking caps on as we go through this interactive process. We also have a number of people online, and Marcus at the back is going to be drawing our attention to input from the people online. So a couple of things of what we're talking about. Number one, I think we're going to be talking about smaller organizations, and I think pretty much everyone here, I'm just going to take a guess, probably represents an organization of 200 and fewer employees. Is there anyone who represents organizations of more than 200? One maybe, okay. Secondly, when we talk about succession planning, we're talking about anyone who's in any sort of leadership position in an organization. So that could be a program lead, a department head, a supervisor, a director, a vice president, CEO, executive director, or chair of the board. So any one of those positions. The reason we're doing that is so often when we read articles about succession planning or go to conferences, it's often a discussion about the CEO succession planning, and often, not always, but it's often international companies where they move people around from the London office to the New York office to the Brazil office and try and see how people make out. We don't have that luxury in our sector. So we're going to try and figure out how we can maximize what we can achieve given the resources we have. So I'd like to briefly, again, introduce the panel, and then I'm going to ask them to expand on their biography. To my immediate left, sorry, I was confused for a second, is Helen Burstyn, who's the chair of the board of Waterfront Toronto Evergreen, and has probably chaired more boards than anyone I know, and probably anyone in the city. So so delighted that Helen is with us. To Helen's left is Anita Abraham. Anita runs an organization called Meal Exchange, a very innovative, smaller organization. And I think when we were looking at the profile of people who typically come to these sessions, we thought it was really important to have a good diversity of larger and smaller organizations. And I'm so delighted that Anita is going to bring that voice of a young organization, and a young person, as well as an organization that has thought about these issues. And to Anita's left is Michael Mori, who's been creating waves since he took over at Tapestry Opera. When I put out some feelers in the arts and culture community about someone who might represent that sector, and who was really thoughtful and innovative, Michael's name kept coming up. And I said, we've never met. I've got to meet this man. So delighted that Michael joined us today. So why don't I then go and I'll first ask you to say a few more words about yourself, if you don't mind. And so perhaps what brings you to your interest in the issue of succession planning, and then we'll get into the discussion. So, Helen?
How about now? Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I love to talk about governance, and I guess that's what brings me to so many boards, and in some cases, in 3 cases at the present time, to chairing boards. Waterfront Toronto is one of them. I also chair Evergreen. Those 2 are sometimes related, but also quite different. Evergreen, better known as the Brickworks, that's the physical site, but it's a national organization and with a national mandate. And the other board I chair is the Walrus Foundation. The Walrus is known mostly as a magazine, but it's actually a foundation that has multiple purposes and an educational purpose at its heart. And those 3 boards, plus others on which I sit, they've had unique and in some cases pressing governance challenges. And I think that's where board work becomes so fascinating and so deeply and necessarily intertwined with the work of the senior management team and the organization itself. One of the things I would add about boards is they have to work in collaboration, in conjunction with their management teams. I would also say about succession planning in particular that there are so many organizations that are in the process of succession planning, but they don't have a succession plan. There's a big difference. And it is kind of a continuous improvement model that you'll find in many places. Things change, people change, not just at the top, but in the core of the organization, also at the board level. And so succession planning is an ongoing kind of exercise. One of the, we'll get into this more deeply in a moment, but I worked with Robin. We first met because he was the CEO of the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and I became his board chair. It's a public appointment. The government decides these things, who goes on the board, and ultimately who becomes the chair. So he was stuck with me. And, you know, we worked really, really well together. And one of the many things we worked on was planning for board succession in an organization where you don't have the luxury of being able to choose, at least not fully. But Robin was a model of planning always. And I think it was you that first pointed out that 10 years is about right. And so as you were approaching your 10th year, you were already starting to let the organization know, the board in particular, that it would be time to move on soon. And I think that's one element. It's not always up to the board or up to the organization. It's really looking at your own role in that organization and figuring out what the best time is to make way for somebody else to put their stamp on the organization, and giving plenty of notice. And in both cases, Robin was a model of doing it right. So I'll leave it at that, and I will pass them. Oh, you've got your own microphone.
It's the mute. Sorry, it's the mute button.
There we go. Great. How about now? Oh, I feel like I'm less. Oh, yeah? Great. Good afternoon. My name is Anita Abraham. I am the Executive Director of Meal Exchange. So we are a national charity that works with young people, university and college students across Canada. So we work on 40 to 50 campuses, working on building a just and sustainable food system. So we do everything, really, from food waste to food insecurity to sustainable procurement, anything that really has our students passionate about how they can show the kind of world they want through food innovation. I've been the ED there for just over 3 years now, I think actually maybe 3 years today. And it's my first time being an ED. It was my first time being an ED. And Meal Exchange was the organization that when I was in university really changed my life, changed my perspective on what it was to make change, what it was to be a young change maker, what it was to be part of a national network. And so for me, stepping into this role of leadership really came from a place of passion and interest and having a nice intersectionality of skills and knowledge and experience. It wasn't because I was in love with being an ED or in love with governance by any means. I have served on a number of boards, both locally and nationally, and worked very closely with my board, clearly, in the role of the one that I hold right now, but I also we recently transitioned a new chair onto our board, and that for me has felt like a major success, which I can speak a little to a bit later. But similarly to Helen, I would say it really is, it feels like for me, succession planning is really a journey. It's not necessarily always about the destination, but it's being sure that you know that there is a destination and that you continuously revisit it, that you are constantly going back to be sure that it's reflective of the vision, the values, the direction, the intentions of the organizations and the people that you serve. I also will say that I'm coming to love to learn governance. I would not say that I love governance right now, but I really love innovation and being disruptive and understanding how we change systems. And I think that governance plays a really big role in that. And there's a really generative relationship that you can look to foster when you're understanding how you can be both innovative and be managing risk and being visionary and making strategic decisions. So I'll leave it at there for now.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be on this panel with everyone and to hear a little bit more about your stories. My name is Michael Mori. I'm Artistic Director of Tapestry Opera, which also at this point in time makes me the head of the company from an organizational point of view. And I'm also the Vice Chair of Indie Opera TO, which most of you probably have not heard of, but there is a collection of about 25 to 30 small opera companies in this city. And a bunch of us came together, and about 12 of us, about 3-4 years ago, to kind of say we'd been struggling on our own, and we wanted to show that there was a scene here, so that's a separate project for me. Tapestry Opera is Canada's only professional company completely dedicated to the evolution of opera, meaning how can we find contemporary stories, contemporary music, and contemporary singers to tell our story. If you were to look at opera from the historical point of view, and you say you look back at Mozart, but then you say, how did Vienna and the culture of the Austro-Hungarian Empire influence Mozart and how he wrote as a composer? And so what we're asking ourselves is, how should Toronto influence the kind of work that we help cultivate and create? Because we know that there's fantastic talent here. We know that we can have great new creators. And we know that this is one of those cities where, like Vienna, so many cultures are coming in to intermingle and co-inspire each other, that there's a great opportunity for a new sort of cultural surge. So Tapestry is experimenting in sort of mixing punk rock with opera or hip hop elements, not only sort of at the sort of popular level, but also in terms of the structure and the approach and the sort of the way that one creates. And generally kind of just looking at opera not as a historical genre, but as a living genre that has a lot to offer and can be a kind of crazy, exciting counterpoint to the digital era, where we are looking at smaller and smaller, but maybe great screens. But the live experience, the sort of mob experience of going somewhere and experiencing great drama with overwhelming music and sound and spectacle is still something that has a lot to offer, if even more so because we've been drawn so much into our screens. So that's a little bit about the company. In terms of succession planning, I came in to a artistic director who was a founder, had been there for 34 years. And so the shoes were big to fill, and there was also a lot of relationships that were personal and not organizational. So my journey has been through a very interesting succession, and certainly looking at the kind of company that we are. We have 5 full-time people and a number of contractors who come in and out. We possibly represent the most common not-for-profit, which is the small kind of startup with a founder who is driven and does a little bit of everything. I think that presents a lot of issues in terms of succession planning, because when you have someone who's wearing 5 hats, how do you plan to replace that? And when they are the company, how do you build relationships with more than one person so that there can be an idea of succession and the company can grow? So look forward to talking a bit more about that.
Thank you. So you have already started to hear some of the stories that we're here to share. And in a moment, I'm going to be asking you to share some stories that relate in some way to succession planning writ large. I'm going to just put forward a working definition for today, and feel free to challenge that or add to that. But this may not sound like an Oxford English Dictionary definition, but something along the lines of the need to prepare to have as much stability in times of transition, respecting the history while preparing for the future. So both looking back and looking to the future, and being prepared for that, whatever that might look like. So in terms of sharing a story, I was thinking of a number of stories in my own past, and I'll share one story perhaps as we get going, which goes back a long, long way in my career, and one of my early jobs, where I was the beneficiary of what I'd like to think of as maybe innovative succession planning thinking by my managers. I was working for this is before I moved into the not-for-profit sector. I was working for a financial institution, and I was at the point where I was an assistant manager in a department of about 50 people. Well-run department. I enjoyed the work. I liked my manager. But I was a young professional and kind of anxious, thinking about what my next step would be, and I didn't see that natural path in terms of what that might be. My manager was great, and she had no plans to go anywhere in the foreseeable future. And I think between her and her supervisor, they came up with a plan to actually carve out some of the department and allow me to run that so in other words, divide the department into 2. Wasn't exactly, but it was a smaller section, but nevertheless, it gave me an opportunity to become a manager for the first time in my career. I think it was innovative thinking on their part, very generous on the part of my manager, and allowed me, it was thinking outside the box, I think, but it gave me that first role at being a manager in terms of what was involved. And in my career, I was then able to build on that experience as I went ahead. And I think what I learned from that was the benefit of thinking outside the box, the benefit of generosity, and this may may sound self-serving, and I apologize, but maybe also to watch out for people who have the capacity to move up and to create those opportunities. So I'll put that story out there. So I'm going to ask my panelists to share a story. I think you already have shared stories, but if you have another story to share. And then I'm going to open it up if anyone here would like to share a couple of stories before we move on. So Anita, do you have a story you'd like to share?
Is everyone okay with that? People who are watching us virtually hopefully can hear us better. So as I mentioned, we recently just elected a new chair to our board, and I think this has actually been one of the things that I have been working on for the last 3 years. So I came into the organization, and there had been a lot of pivots in the organization, that as an organization that's been around for 20 years, but serves university students or college students, what we're seeing on campuses is rapidly changing. And when we're taking on an issue like food, things in that sector are rapidly changing. And so as an organization, we were constantly needing to reflect back what we were hearing, seeing, learning, and respond to that. And one of the things that I kept on hearing as I went out as a new ED and talked to people in my spaces was, well, where is your founder? Like, what has happened to Rahul, who is the young man who started Meal Exchange as a university student. And Rahul and I have had a lovely relationship, really, really powerful for the last number of years. And I started to talk to him. I said, you know, people are asking where you're at, where your voice is in this organization, how your vision has continued to grow with this organization or not, right? To recognize that the organization itself may have changed when he stepped away as ED more than 10 years ago. And I started to realize that as an organization, because we had made so many changes in the last 20 years, this organization no longer was the same organization it was when he started it or when he left it. And so about 2 years ago, I brought him into the strategic clarity process with our board and our staff and our alumni and our students, because I realized that if I wanted him to come back, and I wasn't necessarily looking for him to come back as a chair position, but I wanted him to be on the board. And if I wanted him to do that, I wanted him to do that with a better sense of where we were as an organization and with a deep commitment to what we were doing, like where we were headed. And he loved being part of that process. He brought so much to it. We were able to craft out what is our vision for the next 5 years, what is our strategy for the next 10 years, where are we going as an organization in terms of where we have been and where we currently stand. And I said to him at one point, when I'm building teams, I always kind of play out, you know, what are the roles we need people to play? And I think it's easy to make a list, but I always think of it as like, you need someone who is kind of your guardian, your warrior, your person who is out there, who is telling your story, who is fighting battles for you. You need someone who is your artist, who is your poet, who is your musician, someone who will inspire through story. And you need your engineer, the person who's going to mobilize, the person who's going to make stuff real. And you need those 3 positions, or maybe more, to always be interacting. And I remember saying to Rahul at one point, I said, I need you to be my artist. I need you to go out into the world and talk to people about what has inspired you about this organization, the work that we do, what helped you start this organization, but where we're going. And so, yeah, he joined our board in the chair position a couple months ago now. And as we went out for lunch before we went into our chair meeting, he said, you know, I want to finish this painting. This is a painting I started, and this is the painting I want to finish. And I felt like it was such a longer process than I thought it was going to be. I thought it would be, you have coffee, you ask someone to be on your board, you go about it that way. But I'm so happy to have a successful succession story, to recognize that the time it takes is really worth it for the investment in the organization.
I'm going to kind of contrast my experience with another company that I thought did some incredible succession planning, because the way that it worked in my situation was that the previous and founding artistic director met me and invited me to the company to work with them for a year without telling me that they were looking for a successor, and then at a certain point told me, and then left about a year and a half probably prior to where we had planned to transition. So my learning curve at that point of his departure was a little bit more steep. And I would say where it probably suffered was some of the relationships where a lot of the relationships weren't passed on, and so as a result, I had to start new relationships, as you do. You do what you need to do to succeed, of course, but that required a lot of extra time and sacrificing of everything else in my life for a short couple of years, and that's one way that things go. And I'm sure all of you have seen situations like that. However, I've seen in Victoria, Pacific Opera Victoria has a very progressive company, considering that they are sort of BC's sleepy city. They have a very progressive opera company, and they've, for a number of years, been bringing in people into the company who are basically on the track to become the head of the company. And I've always thought that was incredible. So recently, Patrick left and took over Opera de Montréal, and the person who was second in command took over. And so he had built relationships for the last something like 8 years with people from the community, people from artists across Canada, other producers across Canada, and I thought it seemed like a very organic and probably to the big companies not a very sexy way to find a new head of a company, because we all think that some flashy person who flies in from Australia or from the UK or who's Canadian, who's been working in a big company in Florida is going to be really, really attractive. But the incredible thing was they just kept going, and they just kept growing. And of course, he'd been seeing all of the things that he wanted to change in the company, and that now he finally had the chance to do it. And the disruption to the level of support and the level of sort of just general continuity was so minimal that the organization continues to thrive and continues to be one of the strongest in Canada. So I thought, certainly thinking now as someone who is looking out for my company at the board level, at the general manager level, and at my level, to look ahead and try and see who those people might be, how we could bring them into the company, and so how they could get to know who we are, what it means to wear 5 hats over the course of a year, and what you want to, the kind of people you want to find who believe in the same things that you do, so that the fire is also burning. That's what we're looking out for now. It is, of course, the idea of planning for succession as opposed to having a plan, but at the moment, that's the story I've got.
Great, thank you.
Actually, I can do this. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I almost don't know where to begin. I have all these things rattling around in my head. But it seems to me sometimes what we say is succession planning is actually retention planning. If you have somebody who is so vital to the organization and is probably getting calls from other organizations to be recruited or to show that same success for organizations that are floundering a bit, you also have to make sure that you create the conditions for the CEO or sometimes the board chair, because they're both very important and both very different. The board chair is generally, if we're talking not-for-profits, that's a volunteer. Very important because they choose what time and amount of their talent to give. And they're generally people who give 100% because that's who you want, and that's who they are anyway, because they've been recruited. I'm going to give 2 examples of CEOs who are long-term CEOs, because it was something, well, I think you both mentioned it, where, you know, how long is too long, but if that person is the soul of the organization and has been there for a long time. So at Evergreen, we have a CEO. This has been the only job he's ever done because he founded Evergreen 27 years ago. Jeff Cape, an enormously successful, innovative, just a wonderful person and leader in so many ways. And of course, you look at somebody who's been the CEO of an organization he started by selling plants off the back of a truck to green schoolyards and say, wow, you built all of this. You don't want that person to go away. But you also want to allow room for the rest of the management team to transition, as Robin was saying, and I think you've also alluded to, Anita and Michael. Others have to feel motivated and feel the ability to provide leadership as well. So our role as a board and looking at succession planning has been really to focus on how we can there's the scenario, what if he gets hit by a bus scenario? And that's emergency planning. That's not true succession planning. So we've got a plan for that. We know who can step in. But we also had to bring people along who could collectively do as much as Jeff does himself, and then add something more. So, I mean, those were the considerations there. I'm thinking also, I'm on the COC board, the Canadian Opera Company board. And it's a very successful, long-standing company, traditional, shall we say, the traditional side of opera. But a number of years ago, the company, this is before my time serving on the board, recruited a 32-year-old new CEO from Germany, Alexander Neef, to replace the iconic Richard Bradshaw, who had, under horrible circumstances, left nothing. I mean, there's, he died. And so that was a catastrophic situation. The board at that time and others who were involved with the opera company went about a very concerted search to find somebody who would not be Richard Bradshaw, because that's not fair to anybody coming in. You have to find somebody new, and you have to look at the aspirations of that company, where it could go, how it could modernize, how it could attract younger audiences, how it could. And so Alexander Neef, all these years later, we have just re-signed him, and it's now public, to a 10-year contract to keep him, because he's been so enormously successful. He's one of the most sought-after CEOs for this type of a company in North America, and frankly in the rest of the world. So the thinking has to evolve. I'm also thinking of another organization that I was on the board of, Soundstreams, Lawrence Cherney's organization. Lawrence Cherney, a brilliant leader, musician, so many other things. I can't begin to enunciate them all. He started that not-for-profit organization that's dedicated to bringing new music to audiences of all ages and types. And it's been around for 35 years, and he's the founder, and he's the CEO, or the executive director, and he's the creative force behind everything that happens. So on that board, and it's a tiny board, this is a small organization, never goes above, so 2.5 million a year, and never will be more than that. So not as high profile, and yet very, very important, and has a strong constituency inside and outside the organization. It's very difficult to do succession planning in that context, because it's hard to imagine Soundstreams without Lawrence. So I'll be honest, the way we left it, when, as I say, I'm not on the board anymore, but the way it was left was, we don't know what to do. So advice is always appreciated, but it's one of those circumstances where, and then maybe that's enough, but I just want one final one on the Walrus. We have a brilliant executive director who's also the publisher of the Walrus magazine. Her name is Shelley Ambrose. She's a force. She's gotten us into all kinds of new lines of business. And this is an industry, journalism is an industry under rapid fire and very, very deep change. So, we have a new digital strategy. We have the Walrus Talks. We have a whole bunch, and we have Walrus TV. We have all of these things now. And the umbrella organization, the original concept for this has changed totally, and a lot of that has been driven by Shelley, and yet we also have a number of other high-profile people in the organization, or I won't call them high-profile, but high-powered people in the organization. How to share the responsibility, the ideas, and how not to have a one-person show. Is something that we discuss as a board, and I have to say it's a pretty impressive board too. So I mean, these are the things we also discuss. So enough said on that.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Anita and Michael. So some really interesting stories there. I'd like to open it up to ask if anyone here would like to share a story, either a success or something that's underway, or maybe something that didn't work so well. Anyone? Just while someone's thinking about that, I had one thought, Helen, that maybe it expand to your most recent point about the Soundstream example, which is essentially one person's dream and one person's mission. I'd like to suggest that, and I'm sure this is easier said than done, but that succession planning may not be about preserving the entity as it stands today. If it's a wonderful program, it could well be the succession planning means finding a successor organization to take on the program at the appropriate point in time. So someone whom you partner with today or someone in a similar line of work. Just a thought. Yes? But
one of my questions was on the artistic side, because when you're choosing
yeah, thank you.
when you're thinking especially about artistic succession, it can often mean that maybe the vision is going to change. Is that correct? I mean, if the artistic director is the driver of the vision, so it may be that you're modifying it, or it's rare, I think, that in an artistic situation you're just going to change the person, because that stamp has to lead you forward. Having said that, there's also the opportunity when you're thinking about sound streams and some of the other long-standing artistic organizations in this country. I was executive director of Piano Plus for a long time. And at the end of that, we decided the mission was done and we closed it. And that can be a succession as well.
Thank you. Very good question. And I'd suggest that, it may not only apply in the artistic world, this issue of the vision. Michael, you certainly lived that, walking into someone who had been the leader of the organization for, what did you say,
34 years.
34 years. So you walked into that, and how did the vision evolve?
Well, I guess there's a good distinction between a mission and vision, because you could say that the mission provides the problem that you're trying to solve, and the vision is the different ways that you could do so. So certainly a company, in our case, which was trying to evolve opera or capture the spirit of what opera could be right now, any number of people could have a different solution for that. So that's certainly the way that I approached it. That's also the way that I think this succession should work. My ideas are really going to be relevant for about 10 years. And then if you're thinking of what's up and coming in the world, technology is changing, the way that people consume art and media is changing, probably there's going to be a more relevant vision following me that will be for the most progressive company in Canada in opera that would be more relevant than mine. So I'm trying to think of that as well, that I need to make space for those leaders to come up, whether or not I stay at the company in some way or whether I leave. But it was funny, when Wayne Strongman transitioned to me, it was the same time that another long-standing, I think just about 30-year-old company, Queen of Puddings, which also did really cool creative stuff, closed their doors basically because the co-artistic directors said, this was our project. We don't have the time and the energy to do it at the level that we want to continue doing it, and also we want to do other things in our lives, so we're closing the doors. And that was a very relevant choice, but also tricky because, you know, on one side I'm like, there's only so many places that are creating new Canadian work where you can actually get paid as a composer or a librettist or someone who's trying to say, I want to perform things in my language. And so it was a pity, but on the flip side, you know, maybe that made more opportunity for our company to expand a little bit when that happened. It was, you know, it's one of two ways to go. And it certainly was it felt like a labor for the first 2 years. And that in the last sort of year and a half, we've started to come into our own. And so, you know, I don't know that there's a right way to do it, but I do recognize that looking at the market was really important for me to say, what else is out there? Should we consider closing the company and I can go and do something else? And then I said, you know what, there's not that much out there serving this need, serving this market, serving this artistic goal, which is relevant and interesting. So we should do this. It's worth the labor, and it's worth the succession working.
Great, thank you. Other stories? Yes.
When the question was asked earlier whether or not various organizations here had succession plans, I didn't put up my hand. But upon thinking and having heard the stories and the information shared by the panel, I realized, well, even though we don't have a formal plan, we did recently do two things that I think help in terms of building a succession. One is at the board level, they put in a new, for the 6 out of 9 board members who are elected by the membership, they put in the bylaws staggered terms so that every year 2 different board members will be elected for 3-year terms, so that that will minimize any possible disruption from a large turnover at the board level. The other thing we did recently, and it's something I initiated as the executive director of my organization, is that I created a new director. A small organization, only 5 permanent staff, and usually there's 1 or 2 others, either placement or contract staff. So I created and put aside the money to create a position of director, so that this person is a sort of a reliable, ongoing, second-in-command person who, if the opportunity were to be created or came up suddenly, that person could step into my role as the main executive leader of the organization. So without a plan, sometimes you can still do steps or take steps that help in succession in the long term, even though if it's not an articulated plan ahead of time.
Thank you very much. Helen, you were going to add something?
There's something I wanted to add about creating room for others to show leadership. And I've been on the board of TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, for a number of years.
What board have you not been on?
There's plenty right in this room, but don't. But it's an interesting organization. 43 years old. The CEO, Piers Handling, has been there for 35 years. He has not been CEO. His title has changed, but basically he has been at the helm of this for a very long time. And what opportunities are there to create distributed leadership, or leadership in an organization that has grown a lot and changed a lot. So when an organization decides to go from being an 11-day festival to a year-round set of businesses, not just one business anymore. It's not in the festival business. You get a building, you're a cinema operator, you're a retailer, you've got a gift shop there. Oh, and you've got a condo, right? And you've got restaurants, 2 of them. You've got event space, you've got exhibit space, you've got all of these different businesses. And I remember the board looking at the org chart and going, we don't have anybody who can do those things. It suddenly created, because of those new lines of business we were going to be going into, and building management, suddenly there's an opportunity and panic that we need leadership for each of those areas. Otherwise, it's no, and Piers has remained sort of the overall CEO, with respect for and understanding that all of these other leaders in the organization are also important. You may have heard his announcement before this festival that 2018 would be his last festival. That's a lot of notice. That's something the board requested of him, because it was very important to make that kind of a transition after that length of time, that this be entered into, and to give notice and a thoughtful period of planning is what we're engaged in right now. So I'm on the HR Nominating and Governance Committee. I think every board has different names for these committees, but that one covers the gamut, and that's what we're looking at now.
Thank you. So I'd like to move on now to some of the specific, what we think are some of the opportunities and challenges that we have in our sector. I think we often say, and maybe I said in the introduction, I think that because we represent organizations that for the most part are relatively small, it is very hard often to do the traditional type of succession planning that we hear about when we go to conferences on the subject or read books on the subject. That said, there are many things that we can do and we have a number of assets that we can use. So I'm going to ask the panel the question, and I'm going to start off, if I may, with one thing that I think that works well in our sector. So while yes, when you have a small staff, it often is hard. To me, one of the great benefits of being in the sector, and one of the reasons I have stayed in the sector so long, has been the great learning opportunity that we have from volunteers, and specifically board volunteers. So my 7-year working relationship with Helen as my board chair, I can't tell you, I've never told Helen this, but exactly how much I learned during that time. And today at Sick Kids Foundation, it's something that I find replicates itself every day of the things I learn from our board volunteers. So to me, that's professional development. That helps with my own development in my career, and if I happen to be retiring, but if I wasn't, I think those learnings would definitely be great assets. So that's one asset that I think we have in the sector that we can even take greater advantage of than we have typically. So I'm going to open that up for other thoughts of opportunities or challenges that we have in smaller organizations. Anita? I'm going to ask people in the audience. Maybe Marcus, I'll also ask people online.
Perfect. Thanks, Robin. I would say that one of the things that stands out for me is that I think succession planning allows you to intentionally plan for diversity in your organization. So diversity of experience, diversity of, of like all sorts of things, of skills, of background, of where folks are coming from and how they would contribute to the conversations you want to be having within your organization. And I think that being able to do that without the stress of knowing you have to do it allows you to actually plan that. So we also have emergency plans, but when you're in that state of emergency, which often it feels like we're in some state of emergency, you can't ask the bigger questions of who isn't at this table, what voices are we not hearing. It also doesn't allow us to embrace the tensions, right? So when people are coming at a problem differently than us, or than I am, it allows me to say, how do I bring this tension into our organization to be able to reconcile it, as opposed to creating a culture of fear? And I think that that's one of the things that I've really appreciated about the work that we're doing, both at the board level, but within my organization as well, like with my team, with my managers, with our coordinators, with our students. It allows us to think differently about how do we actually create a culture of change where people are excited about the notion of change, because I find that when you even say succession planning, that usually means someone is going to quit, or someone is getting fired, or someone is leaving under some negative circumstances. And we really want to flip the script on that. We really want to say, no, change is awesome here. Like, to think about, how are you growing? How are you learning? What are we contributing to in terms of, like, what is your life path, and what is Meal Exchange going to represent in that? How is this chapter going to craft a narrative that you're going to be so proud of? And when you leave here, what do you want to feel most proud of? And so those are things that we integrate in when we do professional development stuff, when we do performance reviews. Even when I started at Meal Exchange, I started something called mountain meetings. So one of the things that I found when I came into the nonprofit sector, I worked at Social Innovation Generation for a number of years before I came over to Meal Exchange. And one of the things I found was I felt like everyone was constantly running. Like, everybody was trying to solve problems all the time with, like, really big eyes and really stressed voices. And I thought, it's so unfortunate, because I feel like the work that we do in this sector is so amazing and powerful and transformative. And it is so rare that we get to step back and appreciate that. And so I instituted what I called mountain meetings, and it was so hard to get my team to agree to do them. But essentially, we have to imagine we're up on a mountain looking down at our work and the whole spectrum of things, and recognizing what are the conditions of the system that are influencing our work, and how would Meal Exchange look if we were all up on a mountain or jumping out of a plane or whatever it is. But how do we gain perspective on the work that we do? And now my staff get mad at me if I don't plan one every month. Like, now I am the one who's like, whenever someone is stressed, the first thing out of their mouth is, when are we having a mountain meeting? because there is this really lovely pattern or rhythm that occurs when you're able to actually look at the strategy of change and celebrate how you actually create that, as opposed to how you're just like constantly responding to it.
Thank you. That's a great analogy and a great story. Michael, did you want to jump in on this? Or?
Sure.
Oh,
well,
go ahead.
That sounds awesome.
It's really fun. One day we want to do it on a mountain.
Yeah, gosh. It kind of reminded me of a book that I've read, and some of you might know it. It's a book called Strengthsbased Leadership. But it was something that I hadn't read when I started, and I hadn't ever run a company before. And I do remember hiring a lot of people who I liked so much because, which I realized later, because they were like me, and then not really understanding why things weren't working when we were, not because we were butting heads, but because we were only good at the same things. And so this idea of diversity in the workplace has totally rung true for me. And in the studies that I've read online, it's also a fascinating thing. People who come from different training backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, provide different problem-solving solutions. So you make a much more robust collective leadership when you have representation from different backgrounds, different strengths. So that is a for sure thing. I think you mentioned earlier making space, and that's been a big thing for us too. I think instead of the mountain, we've used the analogy of the train, which is when we started, when we all had wide eyes and panicked voices, we were on the tracks and we could see the smoke in the distance, and we were trying to get on the back of the train. And then as a couple of years went by, we were closer to the train, we could see it, we knew that we'd be able to get there, but we were still kind of out of breath and running all of the time. And then the goal was to get to the front of the train so that we could control the speed. And that, it might just be that in the not-for-profit world, because we're often understaffed and everyone is doing a number of things, it tends to be that there's not, you don't have an entire department to do the things that one or two people may do. So that was our analogy, but now that we're in control of the train, the idea really is, how can we make space for more people? And what are the really easy ways to bring in people? So I'm also a director. Wayne Strongman, the artistic director before me, was a conductor. And so it's always been that there's been an artistic leader, also company leader, and then a practical person who's doing something at the artistic level. But realistically, we know that there's a great need for example, female leaders in conducting, directing, and running companies in classical music. And it's really easy for us to create apprenticeship or intern or assistant positions that will lead to opportunities to grow there. And this came out of conversation with the Canadian opera sector a month ago, where people were saying, well, we've had this problem for a long time, what do we do about it? I said, the easiest thing is see how you can make space without really incurring any dangerous cost to start. Get to know the network of people that you would love to work with, and then you already have a broader network. The broader your network, I feel like the easier the succession planning is, because you've welcomed people into your vision, as opposed to saying, we're the genius, we're going to do the impossible things, and then when we get to the point where everyone's burned out or someone is headhunted, and that person is removed or that leader is removed, then where's the community that's been supporting you all along? So I think it's really great to make space and have good analogies.
Great. Thank you. You guys are really on a roll. It's terrific. Marcus, is there anything online? I guess Marcus will let us know. Marcus is running a little bit behind as the sound goes through, so he'll let us know if there's anything online. Can I ask in the room, is there anything in terms of the question about challenges or opportunities in the sector, in smaller organizations? Yes. In a few minutes, we're going to start to put out a list of what we think are a long list of good ideas, and then we're going to start to boil them down. So.
I think one of the challenges, especially in smaller organizations, is how do you bring a frontline person up through the ranks of management and give them the adequate background in finance, HR, some of those management skills that are missing. If you come in at the top with management experience from somewhere else, that's a different story. If you're a social worker with very different and important set of skills, how do you move up, and who provides you with that training without you having to go out and spend all that money yourself?
Has anyone seen, thank you, that's a very typical experience in many small organizations. Has anyone seen or lived an example of working through that kind of example? Yes.
Hi, I'm Heather McDonald from Loft Community Services. This is perfect timing. I'm taking on the role of CEO on Wednesday. So thank you, very, very timely. I think in terms of that, Loft's vision is always internal first. So they say we want to look at internal, and the value of the board is it's less disruptive. They want to see that continuing of the values. But of course, they have also hired externally as well. And for that purpose, specific projects are designed for those hungry staff that are interested. So that may be a project implementation of a quality improvement initiative around ER usage, or it may be, I mean, we're in the field of mental health and addictions, but it may be different projects that they would then lead with some mentorship, and then they gain those skills. If they are interested, they will get training around those things as well. We're a social work-led agency, so I can understand the challenge that you need to make sure people get that HR skills, but they will get that through those smaller projects and maybe providing them a small percentage enhancement while they take on that additional project. And then there's lots of neat mentorship programs available out there as well. But I just wanted to also identify the importance of the board's strategic planning process, and I know this Loft's a pretty large organization, but in terms of smaller organizations, that I'm coming on board with a really clear strategic plan and a in-year operating plan too. Now I can design what the operating plan looks out for the next 2 years, but I am expected to deliver on this in-year plan. So it's really clear what the board has identified, what they're evaluating me on, what the agency is being evaluated on, what those indicators are. So for me, it just feels very comfortable coming in, and this is a CEO leaving after 35 years. So I can relate to that as well. And I think the only last thing is the values and how important they are to our organization is and during the succession, during this change, all the staff are involved in an artistic project around what our values mean to us in the workplace. And so bringing that and that being our rudder through time of change is our values and how we work together. So that's just something that I'm hoping works because we're in the middle of it. But staff are saying they really, really are enjoying that.
Thank you for sharing that, and congratulations on your new position, Heather.
Did you come through the company yourself?
I did.
Okay.
I did. I've been with them 11 years, yeah.
Thank you. Is there anything online, Marcus? No? Okay. Anything else in the room? Yes. In the front.
I offered for a job in the middle of Africa that nobody else wanted. And they said to me, we want you immediately. And I said, no, I'm not going immediately. I need some preparation. So I think my two big ideas are, number one, succession takes time, takes a lot of time. And two, you've got to give the person the tools that they need. And I needed some language study, I needed some tropical medicine, and I don't think I wouldn't have survived if I hadn't have had those. But the need was so great that they wanted to just slot me in there.
Thanks very much for sharing that. I think we have one more here, Katrina, in the front.
Thank you. I think one thing that I'm thinking about in a number of small organizations I've been in, either on the board or as an executive director, is that recruiting the directors to give you possibility of succession on the boards is a huge challenge for small organizations. Often you're not sexy enough. Often you don't have the connections. So I mean, there's things like Board Match and Board Link and all of those things. But often through them, you're going to find people that are inexperienced, so that it takes you incredible amounts of time to train them all. So I'm just putting it out there as something to think about as we're thinking about 5 good ideas.
I think that is another very typical experience in the sector. So I'm actually going to turn to our panelists because I suspect that they have all had that experience.
We have one more. Excuse me, we have one more.
Oh, sorry. Let's take the, and then we'll come to them.
Oh, I thought I was getting up behind here. Well, I have some. I came here with one question. About succession planning. What happens if the old guard doesn't want to leave? I have a sort of an example. you're looking for some examples of some succession planning. I have one that happened a long time ago when we had some people. We were working with, a bunch of us working with a group, and we were just not really interested in what the old founder of the whole thing had become interested in, and eventually we just sort of packed up. You know, we couldn't get them to change or move out of the way, so we eventually just packed up and started doing our own, moved off and started doing our own thing. And that was one way of solving, I guess, solving a secession problem. We just created our own organization. It doesn't actually have the happiest ending because that person became sort of resentful and got a vendetta going on against us and tried to sabotage us in various ways. But anyway, that's my little piece.
Okay, so thank you, we have two good questions. One is the question about the challenges of smaller organizations recruiting directors who can help you move ahead, both in terms of succession planning, strategic planning, and so on. And another question about what you might do in an organization where someone may be blocking their position, any leadership position, doesn't have to, it could be CEO, could be chair, could be a program leader. Your experiences with any of the above. Who'd like to go? Helen?
Thank you. I'll start with a couple of organizations, smaller ones, where there's been a lot of too much succession on the board. There's just been too much change, and a lot of that has had to do with what you just mentioned, somebody blocking or being in the way. I'll use the name of one organization that you may know. It's called Gilda's Club, Greater Toronto. I was a founder of this a number of years ago with two of my high school friends, and it's really lucky that we're still friends, because there's nothing harder than starting an organization with people that you're not used to working with. And we had one failed recruitment attempt after another to get an executive director, and we have a good one there now. But there's been this revolving door always. They're small organization. They say when the stakes are so small, that's when people really start to argue over them. But actually, the stakes are very high. And they're very important. Gilda's Club is a cancer support community for people and their families living with cancer. Wonderful organization. It's always done fine, but it's always been on the edge, So it's always a very fraught discussion when the board got together, and there was founder syndrome, meaning I didn't have it actually myself, but you'll find that people who found an organization don't want to let go of it and see it a certain way. And board recruitment was how we saw the antidote to that. Bring fresh perspectives in, great new people who support the mission and can help to round out the perspectives. It still doesn't always work. And these are very hard things. I'll also talk about one other example, and that is a more successful one, Harmony Hall Center for Seniors. I was on the board of that organization for a while, and we were also always on the edge. I mean, wonderful organization that provided driving and other services for seniors in East York and a larger catchment area. And because of what was happening and suggested by government at the time with the formation of the LHINs, a local health integration network, they wanted to see more of these small organizations that were providing like services. They wanted to see them merge or come together because there were too many small organizations providing the kinds of services that were overlapping, and there wasn't enough fundraising width and room for all of them to exist. So eventually, our board, because of the merger with Riverdale Community Center, which East Riverdale, it was a good merger. It meant that not everybody who was there before stayed, but the right people sort of took themselves out voluntarily and said, I've stayed long enough. It's time for a new organization with new leadership to take this forward with our combined purpose. So that was a happy ending.
Thank you.
Anita or Michael? No, I'm sorry.
Would you like to answer this?
Yeah, do you want to go for it? Okay. We found kind of early on as we were boarding the back of the train, that our board shared a lot of overlapping networks, and that this was in fact not a strength but a weakness. And so in order to plan for succession, we were kind of drawing on the same pools of influence. And so one of our earlier succession planning things was to diversify the board networks. It feels like this, and the idea of a sort of what is a sexy not-for-profit came up earlier. Articulating the vision and the problem and the vision that solves that problem really, really clearly is possibly the most important thing you can do for recruiting new board members or staff members or anybody. So that did allow us. We had consulted with our stakeholders, which was also a really great thing. I don't know if you ever are in a time of transition. We just held a sort of everyone who's a stakeholder in any way, come and tell us what you think. And one of the big things was people were asking us who we are, because we were doing so many different things, even though we're small. And so we said, okay, we need to really clearly say, of the things that we're doing, what are the most important? When we're moving forward, why these are the most important? And then with that in hand, it was a lot easier to recruit new board members. And then all of a sudden we had great new networks coming in to encounter the art and the work and generally just be exposed to the company. So encouraging board diversity through articulating a really clear vision and the problem that vision is solving is an important thing.
I can just add one thing. So I think a lot about my team too, who would be stepping into my role, or who is stepping into a manager's role, or how do we build the resilience of our organization. And I feel like everyone's saying they're a small nonprofit, but being a small nonprofit, one of the things that I have often said to my team and to my board is, what are we making this decision based on? So when money comes in the door, we often have a tendency to make a lot of decisions. And if we don't have succession planning at like the heart of those decisions, which for me is also about vision, about why are we making these decisions? Is it because we just want to hit these deliverables? Is it because we're trying to build a relationship with a new funder? Is it because of our network and the work that we do and what that looks like? And how do we hold all of the positive things about the way we're making these decisions with where we want to be in 5 years? Because I don't want to be hiring someone or bringing someone new into my organization. It takes a significant amount of resources. And they can deliver on one project, but what is that in the grander scheme of things for my team, for our diversity, for the ideas, for the circumstances? And I think that asking that question consistently has been just a helpful centering piece for us, because I think sometimes we just get so excited to be able to do, because I think we're naturally all doers on the inside of our organization. We also just want to keep on, amplifying and scaling our work, and that we sometimes can get distracted by, and I say to my managers all the time, like, imagine the decision we're making today, someone else has to pay the repercussions of this decision, right? Like, I may not be here when we're reporting on this grant. Are we making the best decision for someone new to be stepping in and to be stewarding this relationship, to be justifying the decisions we're making, or who is inheriting this piece of work? Does it make sense? And just being able to remove ourselves a little bit has been really helpful.
Thank you. Can I ask people in the audience if they have responses to the two questions that were just posed, either about the challenges of recruiting board members in a small organization, or the challenge of dealing with a blocked position, a blocked leader who's not moving on? Any successful stories that people have experienced? Yes, go ahead. And then we're going to be moving ahead in a couple of minutes to a long list of the good ideas from which the 5 will emerge. Yes.
In terms of ongoing recruitment, we do a skills matrix. We constantly review it. We're looking for people who represent diversity in all ways, shapes, and forms, including disciplines within the arts community, which is what I represent. And keeping that not just at the transition point, but throughout the year. Constantly reminding the board to bring forward names of people who they feel would be good matches with the board and fill some of the missing skills we might have.
Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else on either of those questions? Michael?
Early on,
sorry, I'll just,
Yep.
let's go to the back of the room first, and then we'll come to Michael. Sorry, Michael. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm with the Jamaican Canadian Association, and the core of the general membership that tends to be the most dedicated and the longest serving has always been reliable in regards to looking for people to fall back on, to depend on, to be in the board or run committees, especially with an organization like that tends to have a high turnover rate. And there are even some who see that organization as being on shaky ground, yet somehow that core of members that are the most dedicated and longest serving have always been dependable in regards to seeking people successors for certain positions, important positions in that organization. And when it comes to Workers' Action Center, they have programs that train members, like a leadership capacity, conflict resolution, etc., and internships, and that has been very useful in preparing some members to be very valuable to the well-being of that particular organization. Thank you.
Thanks very much, sir. Michael, one more comment, and then we're going to move on to a long list of ideas. Go ahead, Michael.
This is a really quick idea, but this was to the gentleman's point about how do you deal with someone who refuses to leave or change? And this could be at any level. It's obviously most difficult if it's the head of the company and there's a board of directors dealing with that person. But certainly in the case of a colleague or a co-leader, I had very good advice early on, which was continue to articulate your vision that you know they disagree with. And then at a certain point, they will self-select and leave. And in all of my work, since I've heard that, I've seen it be true. If you say, this is what we're really excited about, this is what we're doing, and you know that they disagree with that and that they aren't on board, at a certain point, they see that they don't belong. So it's a positive way to help someone self-select as opposed to firing someone.
Thank you. Really good.
And
Anita?
if I could just add one thing. So when I started as the ED of Meal Exchange, in my first 20 minutes, I sat down with the board chair and our longest standing board member, and they both told me they were leaving the board. And they had seen the hiring of me as their last duty of this plan and were leaving. And I was therefore inheriting, and for those of you who are EDs, part of the way you make your decision is based on who's on your board. And that gives you a lot of security, and you invest in their decision, and there's a whole relationship there. But I was therefore inheriting a board comprised of people who had never been on a board before. And so they were brilliant. They were brilliant young people who were super committed to our organization and who had the best of intentions, who honestly said, we've never been on a board before except for this board. And I thought, oh, Lord have mercy. It was so difficult to imagine how I was then going to craft the organization and my team as well as the board at the same time. I then was also the oldest person on both my board and my team, so that terrified me too. But this strategy of consistently going back to the board and saying, this is what your fiduciary responsibilities are, this is what good governance looks like, this is what we need on a board, these are different models of boards, I would continuously have to get, because they were not there because of bad intentions, they were there because of circumstance, and they needed leadership. But allowing them to then make self-directed decisions about how to contribute, how to navigate, who then to reach out to, how to get trained or where to invest in, seemed to be the only strategy I could employ, because I was in no position to come in and say, hey, everyone should think about this one thing and therefore, redirect. But it has been a significant learning experience for me to really try to empower our board to understand the kind of decisions that our organization needs them to make and that I need them to make, so that our relationship together continues to really flourish for the work that we do.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for adding those points there, Michael and Anita. I think your experience is really relevant to the kinds of things we're talking about. So I've been taking notes as we've been going through, and I'm going to put out about 10 or 12 what strikes me as some of the good ideas that are bubbling to the surface. I'm going to invite both the panel and you to, if you'd like to add, challenge that list, and then we're going to try and boil it down to 5 at the panel while you have a question at your tables. And we should be done between 1:45 and 1:50, so just so you have an idea of the next 20 minutes or so. Okay, so based on what I've been hearing, so I think the importance of reinforcing the values and the vision of the organization seems to be a theme that keeps coming through again and again. The importance of the relationships, that I think that was the theme that kept coming through. So much of what we do is based on relationships, that we should make sure that we don't hog those relationships as leaders to ourselves, but make sure that our colleagues are part of those relationships. The notion of making space, that came up a few times, and to broaden our network, so that as you are trying to make space, work to broaden the network so that we're not, again, talking to ourselves or talking only to people who necessarily agree with us. The diversity was another theme that kept coming up, diversity of thought, diversity of networks, that again, as we're trying to build succession, as we're trying to make sure that our organizations continue and remain relevant, we want to make sure that we're not thinking the way we thought 5 and 10 years ago, but we're continually bringing into play diversity of thought and diversity of ideas. It is possible to take steps without a formal plan, that while I think there was someone who said, well, we don't have a formal succession plan, but once you start to think about it, in fact, a number of things are happening. And I'd suggest that often in a small organization, that's probably okay, as long as it's, you're conscious of what it is that you're doing and the reasons that you're doing it. Sometimes, the continuity of an organization or the continuity of a program may not be to preserve the same organization the way it is, particularly if it's a one-person kind of shop, it's been one person's vision. Maybe there's a way of finding out a way to preserve that, the value of that program, by merging with somebody else, by doing it completely differently. The importance of emergency planning in short term, while some of us, particularly in smaller organizations, may not have a long-term succession plan in place. I think we heard both of the panel and from several representatives, it's really important, essential to have emergency plans and short-term plans again, so that everyone knows exactly what those plans are. Sorry, I hope I'm not going to, I'm sure you're doing brilliantly. Creating the conditions for leaders to stay, so retention planning, that again was one that came up at the panel and came here. We live in a sector where it's so easy because we're so well networked and we're so out there, it's easy for people to get poached, to get stolen away, and we want to make sure that the people whom we designate somehow, we create the positions for them to stay. And I'm going to just take the liberty of adding to that sometimes we don't have the luxury of compensation being that answer. And if that's the case, and that's very often the case, there may be other ways to achieve that. And I just suggest from my own personal example, what had often kept me was the learning opportunity from learning, as I said, from learning from volunteers. So it was those kinds of things that. So it's the conditions, and it varies from person to person. That was one that was important to me, and finding out what those conditions are for the individual. I was interested in Michael's example of bringing in people, I think it was a BC example that you mentioned, of continually bringing people who are on track to be a leader. And every time there's an opening, I think if I understood, to bring in someone who is on track to be that leader. I think we talked about, I'll just mention it perhaps again, creating the opportunities for emerging leaders through professional development and projects and so on, and thinking outside the box. So that's about a dozen ideas there. Can I ask, is there anything that people want to make sure that we capture at this stage before we whittle that down? So the idea again is that we want to come up with 5 good ideas and to really help our organizations in the whole theme of succession planning and continuity. Helen, please.
One other thing that we didn't mention, I think it's important, is that resumes tell only half the story. And it's really important to meet people and meet them more than once and have other people meet them, and also people who have worked with them before. And that's a better way to get a good fit than going by the so-called superstar that has a great resume and may indeed have done wonderful things for one organization, but would be an awkward or ill fit for your organization.
Thank you. Very good. Anything else to add? Or anyone from the audience? Say that again, Elizabeth. Mountain meetings. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and I don't know if I can tie this into one point, but creating the culture at your company where everyone is supporting the vision means that when you transition any one piece, the continuity of organizational collaborative leadership continues. And so part of that, the mountain meetings is part of that, I feel. But similarly, if it's too driven by one person sort of carrying everything on their charisma and their energy and their work ethic, when they leave, you don't have the same drive in all of the other pieces. So for me, it was also planning that transition so that there's no, you can keep momentum. So the company in Victoria, there's 8 leaders at the company moving forward. If you take one of them out, even though it's the first one, the company is still moving forward. And then it's a lot easier to transition someone in, especially if it's from within. But that transition team, so a team that's not going to say, we're leaving the board in your first few months of running this company, but rather, you've got two more years with us so that we can help you transition. So that transition support idea, which also includes culture that cultivates leaders within the company.
And I also don't really know where this idea fits on that list of 12. But for me, mountain meetings, but also the way that we create our culture in our office is really also about dismantling structures of power and privilege in some ways, like really understanding that we're doing this together and that it's not about hierarchy and it's not about, like, there are dynamics of power that we are trying to actually disrupt in the way that we are doing our succession planning. And I think that's a really powerful narrative for our students and for our staff and for our board to all be participating in. Like, that's a very intentional decision. It's not me just saying that and people saying great. So there is a role of power that I think is always important to just be aware of and to name when you're doing this kind of work.
Thank you. Would anyone like to either promote a point or make sure that something gets on the list that is not on the list right now? Okay, so I think what I'm going to suggest, we're going to see how this works. I'm going to ask the panel, can we gather around your computer? Yeah, I know it just might be easier for us to huddle there if you don't. Because I'm going to ask you to discuss a slightly different question at your tables. So the question, and if you've got maybe fewer than 3 people at your table, if you wouldn't mind just clustering with another table. So the question we're asking you to discuss at your table is, looking ahead to the next 5 years in my organization, what are 1 or 2 important succession issues that we should be thinking about? And what is one thing that we can do to move forward? So given what you know, what are 1 or 2 important succession issues that you should be thinking about? And what is one thing that you can do to move forward? So we'll discuss this for about the next 5 to 7 minutes, just as we're clustering to come up with our list. And then we'll come back together in about 5 to 7 minutes. Okay? Okay, everyone. I hope you've had good discussions at your table. And I hope that you're going to be able to leave with some good ideas of what you will do next. I'm not sure we're going to have time to go back to the tables, but we do want to just summarize what we think are the 5 good ideas based on the discussion. So we're going to just go through them one at a time very quickly. So we'll start with Michael at number 1.
So we kind of picked areas to think about, focus on. So starting with people, cultural, and relationships. So ensuring that there's a supportive leadership through the transition, a transition team at the board, mid-level leaders, and other stakeholders. Also making space for new voices and leadership in the time leading up to it. So this is also expanding the net that you're casting.
The second idea really focused around having a solid strategy, plan, vision. So clarifying that vision, mission, values of an organization, and ensuring everyone is brought into those conversations. So a little bit of that conversation we had right at the end about being sure that everyone is on your team, whether that be on your staff or on your board, understands the direction of the organization and feels like their voice is represented and their heart is into the direction of the organization.
The third major area was the sort of architecture of the organization and making it adaptive so that you can adapt the organizational structure itself, the org chart, the business plan, and the governance of the organization and its capacity for change to the organization as it evolves.
Thank you. The fourth is about mobilization, both from the long-term and short-term point of view. So as we are starting to think about these issues, developing the longer-term plans that we need to put into place, which may include things like project plans and getting people involved in professional development. And then at the point of transition, when that happens, making sure that everyone is on board for the mobilization of the activities that we wish to happen. And lastly, diversity was a theme that came up right through the discussion. But by diversity, we mean diversity of thought, diversity of experience, of lived experience, diversity of background, and all those things. So right across, as we're thinking about succession planning, as we're thinking about the future of our organizations, it's about the importance of reflecting and remembering diversity. So building on the discussion, those were your and our 5 good ideas. Thank you.
So I'm impressed. When we had a phone call a few weeks ago, I thought, really, we're just going to rely on the good wisdom of the room to distill down to 5 good ideas, and I had no idea how they were going to make that happen. So congratulations, Robin, for your leadership in making this, getting us to there. And what an incredible panel. I'm blown away by the number of examples. Just such a rich discussion. So thank you, Helen. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Michael. That was just terrific. And great ideas from the room. It's the experience that we all bring to this conversation that makes the discussion so rich. I'm just going to take the liberty of having a microphone to say that this completely reflects, I think, the conversation we had at our table, which was the light bulb went on and it was, oh, you don't actually have a succession plan that you type up neatly with different steps on a piece of paper and put it over there and say it's done. In fact, it's about building a resilient and strong organization that has the bench strength in all these different areas that makes succession simply happen organically and happen well. So I'm really proud of us that we got their 5 good ideas. So please join me in thanking our panel. It's just terrific.